So this evening, the lecture this evening is sponsored by Bernadette Delaney, who is with us somewhere on Zoom. Hi, Bernadette, and thanks very much for doing that. Yes, thank you. Round of applause. And then I'll introduce Gastòn Javier Basile, who's standing beside me, is from Buenos Aires de Argentina, where Jennifer and I lived for 3 years somewhat while ago. I used to speak quite good Argentine Spanish, but not anymore. So that's gone, but never mind. But Gaston is here to remind us of all things South American. He moved to Europe, having completed doctoral studies at the University of Buenos Aires as a classicist. He's moved to Europe, and the last 3 years has been living here in Florence, working at the Medici Archive project and doing some deep research into Medici and South America, which we're going to hear about now. Over to you. Thank you.
Right. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation to give this talk. Well, and when Simon first invited me, I was wondering what would make an exciting topic, right? And reflecting on my work at the Medici Archive project, on various projects, I repeatedly encountered the Medici as a family that were deeply involved in world affairs, both within Europe and beyond. However, unlike other early modern European monarchies, the Medici were not prominent players in the colonial venture. Right? In fact, they were not colonial at all. Yet their knowledge and involvement in international affairs were in many ways extensive. However, this knowledge was rarely first-hand or direct, unlike the experiences of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and later the Dutch, English, and the French. So my question became, how were the Medici different? How did they learn about and interact with foreign lands from what has always seemed like sort of a peripheral or provincial standpoint, nestled in the Tuscan hills by the Arno? So specifically, I wondered, how did they form an image of the lands and people that other European nations were discovering over 200 years or more? So that's how I came up with the idea for this book. Among all the parts of the world that were undiscovered, partly discovered, or well mapped in the 16th and 17th century Europe, I decided to focus on South America. This decision is partly motivated by a sense of nostalgia for the land where I was born and raised, and by the idea that my imperfect knowledge of the colonial history of the Americas, told from the Southern Hemisphere, could inform and complement the narrative from a different angle. The subject is very broad and has become a more popular research agenda in recent years. However, the continent is vast, the time frame wide, and many sources are yet to be unearthed. Simon explicitly asked me to share a few stories about the Medici's connection with South America. Probably he thought I was going to bore you with technical details, but fortunately, I have collected a number of stories that illustrates this tenuous second-hand knowledge of the Medici about this part of the world, right? Knowledge that was nonetheless fascinating. I will also show how they sort of assembled bits and pieces of information over 2 centuries within the evolving colonial landscape. If you would bear with me, I hope to introduce you to a few tales connecting the Medici of South America. Some of these stories are relatively well known. Others still require more investigation, and some are yet to be told. Moving, yeah, good. So returning to my initial question, I believe the Medici's mental picture of the relationship with the Americas resembled sort of that collage like this, right? I think that this composition I personally made very, sort of captures the wilderness, the exoticism and fascination with the Americas, but also reflects the disconnectedness, right, the fragmentation and diversity of the elements, right, that make up the whole. I want to start with this composition because it highlights several aspects of the Medici's imagination of South America, right? So I said fragmentation, yes. The sources the Medici had were very partial and incomplete, and they relied on scattered pieces of evidence, of information. Then I said also diverse, yes. The information they gathered came from a wide variety of informants and reports. And this included various genres, right, such as art, codices, published books, objects, and news items. The diversity of these sources contributed to a rich but varied tapestry of knowledge. And I also said mediation, right? The information traveled to Florence in the 16th, 15th, 17th century very indirectly, rarely stemming from first-hand experience. So knowledge reached the Medici through complex networks and intermediaries with the origins of many pieces often unknown. So this approach was typical of the Medici, and I think that became their trademark, right? They represented the world. In this case, the Americas, primarily through the arts and crafts. They displayed their knowledge as a cabinet of curiosity, right? Filled with snippets of information and precious items that formed a microcosm of a larger world. This method of representation allowed them to construct a unique and intricate understanding of South America in this case, despite its fragmentary sort of nature. So this is the painting, right, that was used for the brochure, right? And there's I don't know whether you know this painting, but it sort of connects to another painting that is perhaps more famous by Jacopo Zucchi. It's called The Allegory of America, right? Which is in Villa Borghese, you may know well. But if you look at this one, it also bears a resemblance to that picture. So sometimes you're even confused though, right? This one instead is by Jacopo Zucchi, right? A Florentine painter who was, and you find it in Palazzo Vecchio. I don't know whether you have noticed it because it's rather hidden. It's in the Francesco Studiolo, right? Which is full of paintings. So this one may go unnoticed, right? But it is it was painted in around 1570s approximately, and it can be considered like an allegory of the richness, the exoticism of the Americas, right? Especially if you connect it to the other painting that came later, yes, which was like the Allegory of the Americas, where you see not only pearl fissures of pearls, right? This is by Alessandro Lori, but you also see people collecting coral, for example, right? So all these elements were associated with the exoticism, the richness of the newfound land, right? I don't know whether you recognize also this. It looks like a map. It is a map indeed. Do you know what part of the world it represents? Yeah, exactly. No, New Spain, very good, or present day sort of Mexico, and it's also in Palazzo Vecchio. So this is in the Hall of Maps in Palazzo Vecchio, exactly, right? So the map of the Americas, right, were among the first created for Cosimo I in this Hall of Maps by Ignazio Danti. He was the name of the cartographer, right? So in the Hall of Maps, or also called the Guardaroba previously, there are 53 maps. Okay? 14 of these maps represent Europe, and 39 represent the rest of the world. So they were very interested in the rest of the world, right? And 9 of them represent the Americas. Okay? So there was an interest, or there was a natural interest in this newly discovered continent, right? In each of these maps had a kind of format. Here there was a title at the top of the panel, a detailed topographic map with measurements bordering it, which were constructed based on accurate maps of the time, and at least one painted cartouche with the image containing information about the place. So there was a map, and then a cartouche with information. And sometimes you also had, not very much in this one, but in many of them, for example, in the African ones or the Asian ones, you have, images, pictures of animals, pictures of people, native inhabitants, and some sort of different illustrations. So in this map, Dante describes in the cartoon up there, he describes the people and topography of Mexico. He explains that the people in the city have converted to Christianity. He compares Mexico City to Venice because it's surrounded by canals. And much of this information was drawn from, published texts, travel narratives, like, for example, the famous Ramusio's Navigazioni e Viaggi, right? It was a bestseller at the time. Obviously, Cosimo and his court were very familiar with these publications, and that's how they obtained the information. But as you see, so far we only see that they had partial, incomplete, right? Information about the Americas as a whole, mostly because it had only been at that time partially explored, right? And within the maps in the Palazzo, you don't see South America, the southern tip of the Americas, right? So that was absent. So you see how the imagination of the continent is evolved and gradually over the decades as more explorations took place, more reports arrived. But in the late 16th century, the last tip of the continent, what would be, the southern tip, Patagonia and Argentina, Chile, and so on, were not represented, which means that, in a way, they didn't know of their existence. Even if they heard that they existed, it did not come into their perception of the world, right? Obviously, things change. So this is a bit more complicated, right? And probably you're less familiar with it. This is not a map, certainly, and it's not a painting. So this is kind of dress, two feather capes. There's one here, and you can find them. You can see them now in the Museo di Antropologia, the Anthropological Museum in Florence. Right? So what are these? Cosimo I, right, during his reign, started collecting many of these South American objects. Many of these objects were actually gifts that were made by different, statesmen, different monarchs from the rest of Europe. This process of collecting was a trademark, right? Was a characteristic of the Medici. So they collected artifacts, objects from different parts of the world. As I said previously, through these networks that enabled them but also many of these gifts had, political implications, right? Because they were gifts made during marriages, weddings, etc. These are, I said before, two Tupinamba feather capes. So the Tupinambas were a tribe from Brazil. And this artifact, these dresses, arrived very early in France, right? So they are recorded, let me tell you exactly, but they were recorded in the 1539 inventory. 1539. So for a city like Florence that was not leading the conquest of the Americas, this was very early. So they are recorded as abiti all'indiana, okay, sort of Indian clothes, things made from Indian feathers. It isn't clear how they reached, Florence. Many people say that they may have been sort of wedding gifts from family members at the time of Cosimo and Eleonora's wedding, right? But it is unclear. There are also reports that feather capes like this were used, right, by members of the court during courtly displays. So these objects were here in Florence. What else? How else did they imagine the Medici? So now we have, this is not an artifact, this is not a piece of item of clothing, it's not an artwork. What is this? It's a codex, right? This is the famous Florentine codex, which is now in the Biblioteca Laurentiana here in the Laurentian Library in Florence, and is dated to 1560 more or less. It is a 3-volume work modeled after Pliny's encyclopedic history. So what is the importance of this codex? It's a very precious codex that is, actually here in Florence, because it's the most important history of New Spain. Documented the lives of the natives during, before, and after the conquest, and it was created by Sagas, who was priest. This was acquired by Ferdinando de' Medici, Cosimo's son, when he was a cardinal in Rome. It was partially translated and copied, and then when Ferdinando moved to Florence to become Grand Duke in 1587, he brought the codex with him. This codex represents the culmination of Sahagun's research and writing in New Spain. This friar, this Franciscan friar, missionary, interviewed the natives about their ancestral past and translated Nahuatl stories, right? And collaborated with artists and scribes. You see, this is an illustrated manuscript. So this is a very important, source and document, which is here in Florence now, about the culture and the history of the native people in Mexico. And finally, we have other kinds of documents about the Americas. These are, what do you think this looks like? It looks like a letter. In fact, it's not a letter, it's an aviso. And I think you heard Alessio, the director of the Medici Archive, a couple of weeks ago, talk, a lot about these avisi, right? That were items of news items that were sent and dispatched and distributed throughout Europe. And Florence was a major hub for the collection of these news items, right? So, for example, this one, I just chose one at random, but this one's very nice. For example, it comes from London. It doesn't come from Spain or France or other cities in Italy, but it comes from London. It's dated November 1655, and it talks of the invasion of Jamaica, right? So the Medici were receiving information from all over the world, what's going on all over the world, not just in Europe, right? So the invasion of Jamaica took place in May 1655 during the Anglo-Spanish War, and it was part of an ambition planned by Oliver Cromwell to acquire new colonies in America, right? So, for example, I chose this one because it has a very beautiful, poetic description of the island, right? So I'll just read a bit of This week, a vessel arrived from the island of Barbados with a report of Jamaica more distinct than the others we have had with this report. That the island is 150 miles long and 60 wide, and that there are many harbors, of which one is most safe and capable of any number of vessels. The country is fertile and delightful. The air is very hot, but is cooled all day long by continuous winds from the sea, which cease at night. The rains, however, for the space of 3 months, last for the space of 3 months, and are continuous. The whole island abounds with cattle and fine horses. There are many rivers full of fish. There is a great quantity of excellent tobacco. But the main traffic consists of korami, for which, in fact, many thousands of oxen are killed, of which there are 2 kinds, and it goes on. So you see how they not only got like political information, but they also got these items, right? These snippets of information that also describe the flora, the fauna, the climate, the weather of these new lands, right? So by now, I think I may have shown you that what were the different sources, right, and the different fragments of information. Nothing is complete, but they drew from a variety of fragments of sources, documents, codices, travelogues, and they figured that artifacts coming from the skits and so on. So that's how they imagined the Americas at this time. Okay. Tuscan travelers in South America. So we'll discuss a few examples. I wouldn't say there were too many, but there were, right? Probably the most famous Tuscan traveler that you may know is the first one, right? Amerigo Vespucci, right? Who was born in Florence. And you know that he was the first to explore South America, and you know that it is said that the name comes from the name of the continent comes from his name. It was not his idea; it was the idea of a photographer, right? That sort of attributed, maybe attributions. So his detailed letters and maps contributed to the naming of America, right after. Then there are other more obscure people whom I'll name, and I'll tell you just very briefly about them. But the list goes on. And what's interesting is that, and I think this is perhaps the purpose of my talk, because we will see later on, that there's a lot to be discovered. Right? So we know the big names, and some of these big names are being, studied and investigated more in the last decades because of the networks and connections, transatlantic networks and connections have become a very hot topic. So there's a lot of research going into these people, right? But these are the major figures. Then there are others that have never been explored because basically they are unknown. Nobody knows about them because they are hiding in the archive. They're hidden there. So another one. They're sort of chronologically ordered. For example, Giovanni da Verrazzano, he was the first to explore the coasts of North America. He's known for his 1524 voyage under the French flag, during which he mapped the Atlantic coast from Carolinas to Newfoundland, right? Another one is Galeotto Che, who explores the Caribbean. Niccolò del Benino, also born in Florence, who hunts El Dorado in the mines of Potosi. Filippo Sassetti, this is quite well known and has been, rediscovered and is being studied more, who only touches briefly South America because there's a shipwreck and he is stranded off the coasts of Brazil, right? But he can be considered, and he writes he writes letters, right, about his letters have been re-edited, and more has been found about his travels. And also, finally, we have Francesco Carletti, whom you probably don't know about, but now there are a lot of people studying this author, and I'll tell you a bit more about him than the other, right? He's a very interesting man because he was the first traveler to circumnavigate the globe on a private voyage. So he was traveling basically as a merchant and as a slave trader, right? Which then he was not very successful as a slave trader, to be honest. So he shifted to other, he bought things basically as a merchant. But now I'll show you what he did. He traveled all over the globe. But in South America in particular, he explores Mexico, Central America, and Peru. There we go. So this is more or less a map of Carletti's voyage. He wrote a book about his travels. That's why we know about it. This book was published in 1701, and then it was also translated into English. But his narrative, his account, remained a manuscript for a long time, right? So who was this Carletti? So Carletti was born in 1573 or 1574 in Florence, and he was from an ancient Florentine merchant family. And in his early life, he was prepared to join his father in commerce. So he was a merchant. So he was sent to Seville in May 1591 to work with another friend, another Florentine merchant. And he undertook this major voyage in 1594. This voyage took him, as you see, all around the world. It took 12 years to accomplish, and he had to undergo lots of hardship and misfortune on his way, right? So I don't know whether you can see the dotted line, but he set out from Cape Verde on January the 8th, 1594 with his father, just to buy slaves in Spanish American colonies. The journey was initially planned to go to the West Indies, but it ended up lasting 12 years. So he went from Cape Verde to Cartagena de Indias, and here he describes the market, customs, and the economic mechanisms. Then he moves to Lima, Peru, where he makes a profitable trade in silver and other goods, and sells slaves for 400 scudi, he said. Then he goes to Mexico City and stayed there from June 1595 to May 1596. He describes Mexico as one of the richest and most beautiful regions of the Spanish Cape. Then he decides to go through Acapulco. He goes to Manila and arrived in June 1596. But an unfortunate fire destroyed the expected goods. In Manila, he documents the customs of the native people and their sexual practices. Then from there, he travels to Japan and China, and he observes the differences in Asian and European maritime practices. Right? While in Japan, his father dies in Macau in 1598. And then he goes on to Indochina, Malacca, Sumatra, Ceylon, you see over there. And he finally wants to return home from Goa after such a long trip. And he manages to embark on a trip, but his ship was captured by the Dutch. buccaneers of Saint Helena, and all his trade, all his wealth was captured, and obviously his sort of story ends miserably, so to speak, because he cannot recuperate his goods, and he spends a lot of money in lawyers trying to get his stuff back, and finally he through France he goes back to Florence, right, where he actually makes the report, the account of all his Odyssey, basically, to Ferdinand I. Okay, that's why his book is called Ragionamenti sopra le cose da lui veduti nei suoi viaggi. Right? So the things that he saw in his travels. So this is an important figure that has been sort of rediscovered, and there are colleagues that are trying to publish a series of essays on this man, who has become very, very important. I don't know whether you know that Ferdinand I made a failed colonial venture, but this is also little known, right? Because it was like short-lived. It lasted 1 year and it failed, drastically, I would say. So it was Ferdinand I tried to set up a colony in Guyana, right? North of what was now the Brazilian coast, right, and Guyana. So this was a secret operation that was orchestrated by the Grand Duke Ferdinand and his ambassador in Spain, but it was completely kept confidential, right? So between September and October 1608, on board the ship Santa Lucia de Bonaventura, which was commanded by an English captain, Robert Thornton, departed from Livorno for the Americas. Thornton was a political exile, but had a lot of experience in trade routes near Brazil. The expedition was also supervised by another Englishman, Sir Robert Dudley, who was a navigator and a cartographer, and he was also the author of the first printed maritime atlas, Del Arcano del Mar. So what happened, you wonder? So they reached Brazil and they returned 10 months later. What they did is they explored the Guayana coast, the Orinoco, and the Amazonas River. We don't know exactly, and this is something that needs further research, right? Because we basically what people know is what I'm telling you about, right? Because they're not so far there are not so many documents that have been found, right, about this expedition. But I think that digging in the archives, one can find a lot more about what happened. Eventually, they returned, right? Thornton brought 6 natives, Aboriginals, to Tuscany, and only 1 survived. How do we know about this book? But basically, we know through the report of William Davis, who was a surgeon on the expedition. So he was on board and he was a surgeon, right? And this report by Davis provides detailed observations of the Amazon region and its inhabitants. So we don't know what they were trying to do here. Some people think that they were also trying to do some botanical experimentation. You know that the Medici have always been interested in botany. In fact, one of the botanical gardens in Florence is one of the first in Italy after Pisa and Padua, right? So they were always very interested in botany. So there's some rumors that they may have also wanted to explore botanically there, but this expedition failed. I mean, it wasn't continued. And Ferdinando died in February 1609. And his successor, Cosimo II, did not pursue additional colonial projects, right? So this is an interesting case that I think merits further research. And now I'm going to go to a case I'm looking into personally. It is sort of mostly by chance. It was a document that was found in the archives, and it's through a colleague in the Medici archives, Maurizio, who knows all about documents in the archives. He pointed to this very interesting and original, and never published. It's something I would like to publish together with Maurice if he agrees to help me. Letter, right, about a mysterious traveler in Cosimo III's time. I mean, we're in the late 1600s, 1680s approximately. It's an so this mysterious traveler in 1685 is an exceptional document in the Archivio di Stato. It provides a rich ethnographic source on the 17th century culture of the River Plate. It provides an opportunity for future research into Tuscan involvement in overseas ventures, because if these kinds of documents start appearing like this one, it means that there are many more to be unearthed from the archive. So, and finally, it provides an occasion for transdisciplinary and multi-perspective research, right, into these documents. Again, it says fragments of a thwarted mission, right? So this again is a failure. So it seems that everything that the Medici attempted, or even Tuscans attempted in South America, was doomed to fail, right? For various different reasons, shipwrecks, failed ambitions, or in this case, it is a letter. The document is a letter written by a person whom we don't know nothing about except his name, and a few other details that are found in the Archivio di Stato, right? But we don't really know much about what he did except for this letter that we have. So the person is called Carlo Diana. What was he doing? What was he doing? So little is known about this man. But his name appears in letters dispatched from Milan by Francesco Bondichi, a Grand Ducal Medici agent in Milan. On February 10, 1683, Bondichi announces that he would send Bassetti the promised curiosities from the West Indies once he's finished polishing an amethyst, and urges to meet a young man, Carlo Diana, who brought these curiosities from the Indies and would soon stop over in Florence on his way from Naples, right? So we just know that there's a man that brings things from the Indies, right? 2 weeks later, Bondichi encourages Bassetti to meet his friend Carlo Diana when he will be in Florence, because he would bring more objects from the West Indies for him and for Grand Duke Cosimo. We have another letter from June in which Bondichi sends Bassetti some curiosities from New Granada by his friend Carlo Diana, is mentioned, including guayacum, petrified guayacum wood, some emeralds from Muso, and he indicates that between February and June 1683, Carlo Diana traveled to Colombia in search for exotica from the West Indies, probably at the behest of the Grand Duke. So we know that this man is bringing things, right? Items in Florence, and is sending them, and he's in touch with the Grand Duke through his intermediary. A year later, in November 1648, another letter explains how, according to Carlo Viana, the indigenous people of Nueva Granada were a multicolored stone called Pantagora. He had said to Florence. And we'll skip this, and we'll go to now we'll go to this document where this letter. I don't know whether you can. There's just a snapshot of the letter. He is writing this letter from present-day Argentina. So we wonder how this man arrived here. Okay? He's writing from the city of Salta. Right? Salta is in the north, right, northwest. When he starts writing, and he asks the Duke, Cosimo, the letter addressed to Cosimo III, asking him to excuse the errors and the blotches that are caused by the numbness of his hands due to the cold weather. So the letter is written in June 1685, which is winter, and it's really cold. So he tells us at the beginning that he embarked upon 3 vessels, and after 35 days of sailing, crossed the equator, enduring violent tempests along the way. After a month at sea, he reached the River Plate and the delta of the river. So he goes on. In this section, he provides topographical indications like the south latitude, where this city, this village actually is, and comments on the fact that the seasons are opposite, right? So June here is beginning of the summer. In the southern hemisphere is winter. That's how he's feeling so cold. But he has to explain that, right? Because maybe Cosimo was not aware that June was a very, very cold month. So all this account is sort of filled with pathos from the outset. And he makes a point of all the adversity that he had to overcome to reach his destination. So it's a very interesting because he mentions, for example, that at the mouth of the river, he encountered the Isola de Lobos, which was populated, you see it over there, which was populated by lupi marini, seeds like seals. Then he says that sailing slowly upriver, they bypass numerous sandbanks, that is true of the river, and after much toil, they finally reached the city of Buenos Aires after 12 days. So it took them 12 days, and you know that it's the widest river in the world, so it takes time. The river here is, he says, is incredibly wide, and one cannot see the opposite shore. He talks about that. The entire journey, he says, took approximately 4 to 5 months to get from Cadiz to Buenos Aires. This is a very interesting source, not only for the history of the Medici, but also for the history of Argentina and the southern, because actually there are very, that I know, there are very few reports of travelers, European travelers in the 16th century. Right? There's a French merchant also that sort of published a book roughly at the same time as this traveler. But aside from that, certainly no Italians are recorded that I know. So this is a very important source I'm presenting to you. So upon arrival, he made several observations, for example. He says that Buenos Aires is a city of about 1,000 soldiers, a bishop, and a fairly large population. Obviously, it was nothing like present day city, right? It was, I would say, it was a settlement, right? It had a fort you see over there. You see an image. I mean, there are no images of the time, but it didn't change much for during the first 100 years of the city. Obviously, there were lots of people from different ethnic backgrounds, many black people, many native people, and there were lots of mixture, right? And also Spanish. So you see here, this is a map of the city dated 1710 approximately, and you see there the fort, and you see those squares are the blocks that make up the sort of the neighborhood, right? So it was a very, very modest settlement. All right, but the fact that he went there is showing that of all the other cities, I mean, he went so far. Nobody had gone so far. Why did I mean, no Italian, at least, merchant that we know, went so far. What was he doing there? What was he trying to do? He wasn't an explorer. He wasn't trying to discover anything. He was a merchant. So now with the history of Argentina and some the Virreinato de Rio de la Plata comes in, because at this time Buenos Aires starts becoming, right, roughly at this time, a more important point. Why? Because it had a port, okay, a very big and port that obviously in the future centuries would become extremely important. But why was this port relevant at this time in India? Because the Spanish, right, needed an outlet to the sea to ship, particularly silver from Potosí, right? Because it was very expensive for them to use the ports in the Pacific, right, which they used previously. But now they had a port in the Atlantic, okay, that allowed them to ship the goods to Europe more rapidly and more conveniently. Okay, and with the silver from Potosí came a large number of other products. Mainly, it was not only African slaves that were traded, right, that were taken from one place to the other and through Chile, and particularly by the Dutch. There was a huge slave traffic in the region, which has not been much discussed until very recently. But it was also leather. Leather was a main commodity, main goods, right, that was commercialized at the time, and all sorts of smuggling of different sorts, right, of all other products. But what happens to this man? He's there in Buenos Aires, and we hear it in the letter that he wanted to go to Potosí. His idea was not to. He just wanted to look around to see what he found, right? Because obviously, I think there was not much information, right, around about this city that far. So he had heard about the mines of Potosí that were legendary, right? And the fact is that he's not allowed to continue his part. The authorities would not allow him to follow, right, to continue. So he has to escape. He has to escape. And where does he go? Well, this is something I mean, he doesn't mention it, but I had to look into my old, books and sources to see what did this man go? How did this man at this point in history get from Buenos Aires to first Cordoba and then to the north, Salta? It's about 1,500 miles he has to, get to reach Salta. So it's a long distance. So how did he manage to get there? What route did he take? So what we know is that at that time, the route that goes from Buenos Aires to Cordoba was called the Camino Real, right? It was one of the only routes that were available, and there was also another route that would go to Santiago de Chile, and there was a third route that would go to Asunción. So, in Paraguay. All right. So, can you figure out what the landscape may have been like, what he had to undergo, in this region here. Actually, there were no mountains. It was very flat. It was grass, basically grass. So it was called the Pampa, right? So the famous pampas that are, world famous now because of the beef. And in fact, what is curious, I mean, striking, is that he actually mentions this, right? So he says that this place, and he calls it like this, a sea of lands, of grass. He says terra di erbe, mare di erba, mare di erba. So it was a sea of land. So that is very dangerous because it's like being lost at sea. So if you don't know your way, you die because there are very few water courses, or you need to know where they are. So you need someone to take you. Where do we? Because from the distance from Buenos Aires to Cordoba, which was more of another settlement that was sort of inhabited, at least, it's like 800 kilometers. So how do you, make that distance when there's nothing but grass? And so, well, obviously he had to take a caravan, right? So I don't know how he managed to probably bribe someone, but he tells us that he was taken by Indians, right? So there was a route, right? There was this Camino de Real, and obviously there were these caravans, right? That I think you have an image there, something very rudimentary, right? These caravans where they took stuff, and particularly leather goods, and meats, and so on, and they travel distances, right? He said that the ones that were carrying him were leading him were Indians, but that cannot be the case, right? So he was mistaking the Indians for what later, I think, came to be known as gauchos, right? So they were not Indians in the sense that they may have had some native people background, sort of, but they were not certainly Indians, because the Indians at the time, what the people called the Indians, were warriors, right? They were very fierce, and they often attacked the caravan, like in the United States, the same story. So so these people, these Indians that he took him all the way. And there's something very interesting that he does here, because he provides ethnographic vignettes, right? He mentions a few things that are curiosities, right? Exotic things for the reader, because he's writing to Cosimo I. It was a letter that he sent, actually, and that Cosimo received and kept. So, for example, what are the kinds of elements that he mentions? He mentions some struzzi selvatici. Do you know what those are? They look like ostriches, but they're not ostriches. They're called nyandus, right? So they look very much like ostriches, but they are a bit smaller, right? And obviously, at the time, they were hunted and they were eaten, right? So the animals that live in the pampas in various parts, right? As I said, again, when he mentions Indians, he's not referring to the Indians that were taking him were certainly not Indians, right? They were, people that were working as labor, right? They were paid, or they were smugglers many times, and they were taking people through the pampas, and they had to know a lot about the land they were, because many times they were attacked. They had to know where to get the water, where to get the food. And there's something interesting, because he makes a description of how they fed themselves. So what do you do in the pampas? I mean, after days, if you're hungry, what would they do? Well, they would simply catch a cow that was there, because it was full of free cattle, and they would just kill it and they would roast it. So he provides a description of how they made an asado, right, a barbecue, and it's very interesting. And about the method they used, how they cooked it, how they cut the animal, and he also comments on the quality of the meat, and exactly as it hasn't changed much in 300, 400 years. So, finally, an unfulfilled promise and an uncertain end. What happened to this man? We don't know. This is the only letter we have so far. What we do know is that he's still alive, so he didn't die. So probably he managed to make his way all the way to Potosi, and from Potosi he returned to Europe, because we have other letters, right, mentioning him in 6-7 years later, 1691, 1692, also in connection with objects that he was trading from one place to the other, particularly in Central America. I think that he didn't want to venture that far anymore because he didn't have a good experience there. But what was he? That is interesting, and this, I think, it connects with what I was telling you at the beginning. Who was he? At some point in the letter, he mentions that so far he was unable to find these precious stones and shells which he had promised he would send Cosimo's wife. So his mission was to find these exotic items as a gift for the Grand Duchess. Okay? So basically, I started to conclude. I started my talk wondering what understanding the Medici had about the world and South America in particular. I think there's no straightforward answer to this. I believe that it was a largely fragmentary, mediated, and polyphonic worldview that developed and evolved over the decades. What is typical of the Medici is their ability to translate these snippets of fact and fiction into artistic and intellectual perception in the early modern period, while playing a peripheral role in the European colonial configuration. Right? There is still much to do to provide a more consistent narrative. Unedited sources like the one I just discussed are possibly the tip of an as yet unexplored archive. We may have many more stories like this. This may shed light on the Italian involvement in the transoceanic voyages and their perceptions of foreign lands, especially in the comparatively under-researched 17th century. There are also important documents to understand how the colonial subjects were perceived on the other side of the Atlantic. And I will finally conclude by quoting the words of your beloved Shakespeare, as usual, who, as usual, has a quotation for everything and probably resonates with the spirit of the time. What are they that would speak with me, says Horatius in Hamlet. Seafaring men, sir. They say they have letters for you. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. My microphone's not very strong. Thank you so much. And as always, we now move to the question and answer, and I'll find the Zoomers. And as always, the rules are the same. If you're the Zoom and you want to comment, you can put something on the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf, or you can unmute and talk to someone hear you in the room. I'll put some lights on so we can see ourselves. And if you're in the room and want to say something, yeah, got rid of it. Yeah, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone, because you need the microphone so the people on the Zoom can hear you talking. Have we got anyone who wants to break the ice? We've got something over there.
My question is about the crew that was on some of these explorations. I'm wondering if in your research you've come across any information about trained physicians or apothecaries that would come on these trips and maybe particularly have some skill with identifying or characterizing plants that they would discover?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in fact there were there was the case I mentioned, the case of Dudley, right? In Ferdinando's failed attempt to found this colony. So there was always a surgeon on board. There was always a surgeon on board. That surgeons were these kinds of people that had a sort of a semi-professional training, right? Some were more professional than others, right? So I don't know, but actually there was a lecture the other day at Medici Archive, right? A person was actually, and this is something that has not been much explored actually, what these surgeons did on board. But apparently they had a very important role. That's why there was always one, and they got fairly well paid, right? So many were actually willing to embark because they got like a good payment for their job. And this is basically because, I mean, in order to sail, you need people that are in good health. And if they get sick, they need to be cured, right? If they're wounded, they need to be cured. So you always need a doctor, okay? And there were many times that these crews were very heterogeneous, right? So there were all sorts of people. You also had the sailors, but you also had, for example, botanists, naturally. So particularly in the 17th century, I mean, they started much earlier, but I mean, even when Columbus discovered America, you know that there were people that made botanical observations, right? But in the 17th century, this became very frequent, and there were naturalists, botanists that traveled, right, with these crews and took plants and species and made observations, right, and then reported. So yeah, it was.
Okay, thank you. I know the Zoom was that Sarah's put the reminder up. So your very last chance to make your contribution to the lectures. So better miss it, but otherwise we'll have to wait for September. Anyone on Zoom want to add anything on the comments or on mute? What about in the room? What else we got? Two more. We'll go here first.
That was terrific. Thanks a lot. You talk about these networks, like there's the empires that are moving around trying to discover, but then there's all these commercial networks also that are going on their own steam. And I'm not confused. I'm just wondering how these different networks were playing together.
It was very
it's very informal.
Yeah. So what I've read, like in while I was doing this, also was making this presentation, is that particularly in the 17th century, right? For example, the Spanish crown at some point, this kept changing, right, because of their conflict with the English, with the conflict with the Portuguese, right? So over the lands or the jurisdiction that they were supposed to. But at some point, the 17th century was not very prosperous for the Spanish, right? So at some point, they allowed merchants, right, from other nations to do trade, right, for their benefit, right? So this is, for example, the case that we saw of this Italian merchant, and it was also the case of Carletti. What was Carletti doing, right? The one that circumnavigated, right? And many of them were involved in the slave trade, sadly, right? Particularly in the 17th century, the Dutch were very active in and the Portuguese too, in the slave trade. So many were they just bought slaves and sold them and made money, right? So that was one of the major activities they had. But there were also merchants, trading all sorts of goods depending on where they went. So it's true that there was like this parallel sort of universe of merchants. And in the case of Buenos Aires that we saw, there was a lot at this time in history, 17th century, there was a lot of smuggling. It was famous, but there's probably still is. But yeah, smuggling, right? So there was a lot of people, taking goods and shipping them to Europe, not paying what they had to pay, and trafficking leather, trafficking silver too, silver from Potosi. But at this point, sort of African slaves too. But at this time in particular, leather and all the products that were derived from cows, which were just, there was a big demand of market for these products, and there was it was full of these animals that were just roaming there freely. That's why they just ate them. At some point, in fact, this traveler just mentioned, it's amazing to see how many carcasses, how many bodies of dead cows there are everywhere, because people just ate them because they were just roaming freely. They still are. That's why the meat is so good, right? Because the cattle is just there and grazes on the land, and so they move, and apparently that creates the quality of the meat different level.
Unless you've been there, it's hard to actually imagine just how big the Pampa is.
Yeah, you were there.
We were there, and we had friends at a place called Tandil, and it was an 8-hour drive, and flat, just grass and cows. Yeah, it goes on like that. So,
thank you. Very interesting. The prose, the style of the prose, does it have any antecedents that you can see? Because at that period, there wasn't a lot of prose writing. I mean, there was Cervantes with adventure writing, but not a lot of that kind of writing was going on just at that time. Well,
there were travel writing, was a genre, right? But it's good. The question of the style is very good, because there is something also rhetorical about the way he wrote this letter. Okay, not only this man, also the case of Carletti, for example. That we didn't read anything of what he wrote, but it's written in a way that he's following kinds of topos. How do I interest my audience? How do I manage to captivate them? So he was following a certain pattern, so to speak, and going through. So, for example, the last letter we saw more in detail. He starts by saying that he has barely survived. He's just there, because God is big or whatever. But he managed to barely survive. But he had to face tempests, and as he was passing through the currents, then that he couldn't disembark, then that he was nearly eaten by the Indios or whatever, that he had to escape. So there was all these hardships that are parts of the travel narrative, right? And then there's also something, going back to the prose, there's also this idea of the description of the exotic. So from the first chronicles, right, of the Indies, like, which were mostly Spanish and Portuguese that were writing in the early, when these lands were first discovered, right? So this became a topos where you provide like details of everything that is exotic, of everything that is different from what you find in Europe, right? And this is a common theme. It appears everywhere. So, for example, in this last narrative, he focuses on specific items that he wants to talk about, which are actually the ones that are, exotic. Even if you go nowadays, you still focus on the same. Even people who travel to Buenos Aires, they still notice the same. So nothing has changed. But then obviously the city is completely different, and it grew, and it's a beautiful city. But if they travel through the Pampas, they just say, "Oh, this is endless. If I get lost here, if my car breaks down, what do I do?"
Punto.
You're in trouble. If you're right, yeah. If you don't find a petrol station, yeah, you just have to sleep in the car.
It's a bit like being in the Sahara Desert, except there's a lot of grass. So it's better to be a cow than a person in Tampa. Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It was really fascinating. I have a question about the Avviso, about the conquest of Jamaica. It was in Italian. Was it written, in the beginning, it came from London. Was it written in Italian originally, or was it translated once it got here?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether Alessio, who talked all about the Avvisi, mentioned this, but these Avvisi were translated, right? Or there were people who translated them. There were people who copied them down. And then many of them were originally written in Italian because probably this was an informant that, I mean, the Medici had dispatched. They had informants all over Europe. And obviously, we also see that they had informants as far as Buenos Aires in the 17th century. So they had people telling them about the world, literally everywhere. So they had these like foreign correspondents, these networks. They had ambassadors. So ambassadors were many times a source, but then they had other people that looked at other things, right? Because ambassadors like spies, but they were just. It's like the newspapers nowadays. What do you get in newspapers? Well, you don't only get about the king, the queen, the president, I mean the politicians. You also get news about what people wear. I mean, what's the latest fashion? You know, how the game went on Sunday, whatever. So these people also provided details about all these other aspects of the cultural life of the city, or whether something was discovered, new land, there was a war, there was a conflict.
Okay. I haven't got any more for any more. We can continue. Jacqueline, did you want to say something? No, you're just waving at me. It's okay. Don't make any gestures. You'll wind up buying the palazzo. Yeah. So we can continue the conversation over the wine. So it remains to thank Bernadette very much for the sponsorship. I don't know whether you're still with us, Bernadette. Yeah. Okay. And to thank Gastòn very much for a fascinating lecture. There's so much to talk about. Yeah, and we can continue the conversation over a glass of wine from Rufino, our seated sponsors, who have got through there. And we're just to say, again, we'll see you all in September when we're currently working on another fabulous program. Thank you.